Hey y'all, how are you? Yes, it's 80 degrees in Idaho. I'm having a little cool rosé and wearing my tank top. It's all good. Happy Saturday to everybody. Thanks for joining us. I want to tell y'all, I know that we have lots of folks who have been here with me since day one, and I appreciate you no end, but we have gained 2,000 subscribers in the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce myself. I don't usually, but I'm going to introduce myself. I just usually figure you know who I am. But I'm going to take a minute and introduce myself. I'm also, oh, you heard that door slam. I didn't have my office door closed. Now I do. So, my name is Lori Hellis. I am a retired criminal attorney, did both prosecution and defense over the years. And I retired about 4 years ago because I wanted to write. I guarantee you that writing true crime was not on my bingo card, and yet here we are. So, I am under contract with Pegasus Books to write a true crime book about the Lori Vallow case. And I moved to Boise, Idaho in order to cover the case. And from beautiful Mesa, Arizona, which is why I'm complaining because it's been so cold all winter. And so here we are. I've been in the trial every day. And I'm here on Saturdays to give you a little wrap up of what's been going on. We talk about legal issues. I usually start out by sort of doing a little bit of a wrap up to begin with, and then we take your questions. And I have some of the smartest followers in the world. You guys ask amazing questions, and we answer every one of them that we can. So I'm going to dive right into it. First of all, I want to thank everybody for being here. Our chat has just gone through the roof. And if you haven't been here to enjoy our chat, I'm glad that you are here to join us because you're in for a treat. One other thing I want to mention is I'm a quilter. And so I always get this backwards. The squares that are up on the wall behind me are part of our True Crime Quilt Guild. So if you are at all interested in quilting, it is not too late to join us for this little quilt along project. If you are new to quilting, I have some how-to videos up, and this is a really appropriate project for a beginner. I know it looks complicated, but it's really not. So join us if you're at all interested. So the only last thing I want to say is thank you very much to my moderators who are very faithful. And I want to remind you all that all of your Super Chat and PayPal donations go directly to our mods. And the only thing that I have out there is buy me a coffee. So that's in the show notes. If you want to caffeinate me for court, I appreciate that, but not at all required. We answer questions out of the chat. Now, I'm not going to lie; it's much easier to catch the ones that come up in a bright color because they have a super chat. But we try and answer every question. My mods are great at catching them. It's helpful if you start out in all caps or a line of question marks or something, the word question. That just makes it easier for our mods to pick those questions out. If for some reason we don't catch your questions, put them in the show notes because I'm doing my best to answer all your questions. If you're a little shy about that, you can always email me. My email is also in the show notes. Right now, I'm a little slow getting to questions thanks to being in court all day, every day, but I'm doing my best to keep up on them. So let's dive right in. I want to go back and start with Summer Shiflet. Now, Summer was there. Summer, for those of you who might be new to this case, Summer Shiflet is Lori Vallow's Daybell's sister. She's been married 5 times, so she's got 6 last names, including her maiden name. So She is the youngest of Lori's. There were 5 kids, so the youngest of the 6 siblings. And I'm sorry, there were 5 siblings, and Summer is the youngest. So Summer came to court, and she testified to a couple things that I really wanted to go back to because they're a little interesting. So in Lori's sibling group, there was Stacy, her sister Stacy, who was the eldest and who died at age 31 of complications of juvenile type 1 diabetes, as well as coupled with an eating disorder. And Summer had some pretty serious problems. Well, she died at age 31. She had a daughter whose name is Melanie with an I, no IE. That's important because there's 2 Melanies. But she is Melanie. Her maiden name was Cope. She was married to Brandon Boudreau when this whole case started. She is divorced from Brandon and married now to Ian Pulowski. So you'll hear those names. So the other siblings were Lori's brother Adam Cox and Lori's brother Alex Cox and Lori's younger sister Summer, who is Shiflet. So Summer's the youngest of the siblings. So it was interesting because a lot of people didn't know that Stacy even existed because she was left out of the Netflix documentary for reasons I'm not really sure. I should have asked that when I was on with Sky, the producer of that documentary. I was on Surviving the Survivor with her a couple weeks ago. So anyway, she got on the stand and she had some really interesting things to say. She said that she and Lori were close growing up because they were only a couple of years apart. Lori was 2 years older, and that she went through the whole family tree and who everyone was. She also mentioned that they had a sister who died at age 6 weeks. Now, I had heard that there was another baby and that her name was Laura. But what I didn't know was they called her Lolly, which is sort of interesting because one of Lori's iCloud accounts is under Lolly for Fun, I think, or something like that. And so it was interesting because one of the things Lori has always said was she believed that Summer, that her daughter Tylee was her sister Stacy reincarnated. Yes, this is a very interesting story. So that was something I did not know, that they called her Lolly. The next thing that comes up is she goes through the family tree. She talks about the fact that she couldn't imagine that her sister would want to kill her children or conspire to kill her children. She had never heard about all the ideas about reincarnation and multiple creations. Now, this whole family, they are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Lori and Chad were also lifelong members, and some of these beliefs were sort of spin-offs of their lifelong teachings from the LDS Church. So she said Lori had never talked to her about reincarnation. She had never heard it until 2018. Then in late 2018, Lori told Summer about previous lives. I'm reading off my laptop, so if it looks like I'm reading notes, I am. I'm reading off my notes I took while we were in court. Summer said that was new to her, and she said she tried to believe, but it didn't make any sense. Summer said she didn't remember Lori ever talking about zombies, but she did talk about her ability to cast out evil spirits and about light and dark spirits. She was close. Summer said she was close with Alex Cox initially, but that he was my big brother. Sometimes he was hilarious and fun, and sometimes he was crude and obnoxious. This was interesting. Now, I had heard a little bit about this, but I thought that what Summers' testimony really sort of crystallized for me. Alex Cox had a brain injury in a car accident as a teenager. And she said from then on, it seemed like he was stuck as a 16-year-old in his decision making. She said she stays in touch with Colby, and she agrees that after Lori Vallow met Chad, she changed. So the defense had intended to call Summer as a witness, and so the court allowed them to. Typically, what happens when you're asking questions in court is the person who calls the witness asks questions on direct, and then the other side has the opportunity to cross-examine. Cross-examination is limited to what was asked in direct. So you can't go off on a tangent and ask questions that have nothing to do with what was asked on direct. But the court gave them permission to only call Summer once. So they gave the defense permission to sort of go off script a little bit and ask their own set of questions for Summer. Now, one of the things that came in with Summer was a jail telephone call that Lori had with Summer. And it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking for a number of reasons. Similarly to Colby's number. She says, "Hey, Summy, how are you?" Summer says, "Not good. How are you?" Lori says, "Not good." Excuse me. It is allergy season in Idaho. Summer says, I don't know what to say, but I'm willing to listen. Now, this recording, it has been downloaded, and you can find it on East Idaho News website or on their YouTube channel. And you can listen for yourself. I have not yet transcribed it. I will, but I haven't done that yet. And so I just kind of took some notes as they were going along. Summer says, Summer starts crying, and it's very hard to understand. She says, they found the children in Chad's backyard. Did you know they were there? Lori says, I can't talk about it. Summer says, you threw them away like garbage. And Lori says, do you think I let that happen? And Summer says, what else could I think is what she says. Lori says she can't talk about it. Summer says she doesn't understand. There they were on the beach getting married and looking like they didn't have a care in the world. She once again, just like she did with Melanie Gibbs, says, you know me. And Lori is very calm. Summer is nearly hysterical. She's so upset. And Summer says, once again, just as Colby said, we would have taken them. We would have taken the children. She comments to Lori that Lori didn't even call Summer when Alex died. She had to find out about it a month later. And so it's really a heartbreaking call. And finally, the defense started getting to the point of beginning to ask some questions about Lori's strange beliefs. That was really the first time that there was a clear sort of delving into these strange beliefs. So the next person up was Richard Schmidt. He was employed at the Rexburg Police Department. He's now the head of the public safety for BYU Idaho, which is the BYU extension in Rexburg. But at that time, he was helping out with surveillance on the gray Jeep. And then later he was assigned to go to Springville to interview the family of Tammy Daybell in December of 2019. He prepared warrants, and because they received a tip, probably from Colby, that there had been activity on Tylee's Venmo account, they got warrants for Venmo. He received video footage from Fremont County from Yellowstone, and he reviewed all of that Yellowstone footage. He saw what turned out to be Alex's silver Ford pickup on the video, was able to identify it from the license plate, and pulled the ticket booth video and was able to see that Alex was the driver. The passenger was female, but he couldn't quite tell who it was. And the lady in the booth appeared to wave back at somebody in the back seat as if she were waving at a child. He also went to the Self-Storage Plus and got all the video footage from the self-storage place. The owner released all the video, and he saw Lori Vallow and Alex Cox and Chad Daybell in and out of the storage unit. On the 1st of October, Lori Vallow went to the storage unit and dropped off a box and a tote. On the 2nd, she and Chad Daybell moved a spare tire and the auto back seat into the unit, and then the next day they picked it up and the spare tire and the seat. Now we know that that was the third row back seat that was in the Jeep Wrangler and the back spare tire, because they had to pull it out because Alex was back there trying to take a shot at Brandon Boudreaux. Now, what we haven't seen, and it may come in the Arizona cases, it's more likely it'll come in the Arizona cases. We didn't see it because it's probably not super relevant to this case, but we do know that highway license plate readers and video surveillance on the freeway identified that Jeep, which was Tylee's Jeep, driving from Rexburg to the Phoenix area and back during that time that Brandon Boudreaux was shot at. So I'm not going to get in at length to how that all came about. So for those of you who are not familiar with the case, you'll have to go back and track down the story of why Brandon Boudreaux was shot at, that Alex Cox shot at him and missed. So then Detective Schmidt also was at the scene when the bodies were found. And so he testified to what he saw during that. I'm not going to go deeply into his testimony. It was fairly cumulative about what we already knew about the scene. Although one thing he did say, which comes up a little bit later, is it appeared that someone had poured what looked like quick concrete or some sort of cement over the site where Tylee's remains were found. There's also some indication in the testimony that we hear a little bit later about her bones, that there was evidence that a predator had chewed on one of her bones, which made me wonder if perhaps after she was buried, something dug that site up and they put everything back in and covered it up with concrete, hoping to keep it from being disturbed. The next person was Steve Daniels. He's an FBI special agent, and he was the ERT team's senior leader. This was very difficult testimony. He was the leader of the evidence recovery team for the FBI, and they were the lead on recovering the remains out of Chad Daybell's backyard. So there were some interesting things that came out of that. There were 8 people from the FBI there. They assembled the team a week before and had a week to prepare and do all the planning. They staged at a nearby church parking lot, And then once Detective Hermosillo had served the search warrant and the place was secured, they came in with all their gear, with a trailer full of tools and the mobile command center, and went to work. They had an area that they wanted to focus on, but they searched the whole property, created an exhibit that documented their operation on the property. And it was kind of an interactive, like a PowerPoint sort of a display. They used a Faro scanner, which we heard about in the Murdoch case. We've heard about it in other cases. It is a machine that creates a laser map of the area. It's all done with laser measurements, so it's very accurate. So they searched the whole property. They knew that they were looking for a couple of places. One was an area next to the irrigation retention pond that had a tree next to it. And under that tree was an area that they had identified. And one of the ways that they identified it was that the grass was a different length between either side of this area, and the grass was shorter where it had been disturbed. And then they also noticed that the dirt, or the earth, was sort of mounded up in that spot. He went through talking about how they found, they took the soil off the top, or the sod off the top layer, dug down, and within a short amount of time found these flat paver stones, light colored. They looked like patio stones, like something you'd make a patio out of, kind of irregular, but patio stones. And there were 3 of them. And then when they took those out, they found this thin plywood. And in pulling up the thin plywood, there was dirt, but there was something in black plastic protruding out of the dirt. And it was round, and it was JJ's head. They opened that piece of black plastic, peeled it aside. Now, mind you, we saw all of these pictures, and there was a white plastic bag. They cut a small enough hole in it to determine that there was brown hair underneath it, and then they continued to excavate. They excavated around the entire plastic wrapped mass and took it out of the ground and took it to the coroner's van. So there were a couple of interesting things that I noticed that I had not heard before. We'd heard in his preliminary hearing, Chad's preliminary hearing, we'd also heard earlier in the trial descriptions of how JJ's body was found. But what was interesting to me was when the photographs were shown, and I don't want to get, first of all, understand that as a retired defense attorney, I have seen a lot of disturbing images. This is not the first time I have seen these things, but it clearly was the first time a lot of the people in the trial and the jury had seen before. And there were some hard images for them to see. So one of the things that I noticed that I had not heard before was the plastic was pulled very tight. The black plastic was pulled very tight. The duct tape was around the body, but it was very tight. It almost looked like a ball, where it was very flat. And when they opened up the black plastic, the white plastic that was covering his head was also very tight against his face. He was, when the autopsy, which we'll get into in a minute, when the autopsy was conducted, And we heard about this. We heard about it in the preliminary hearing. So this is not new information. JJ's face was wrapped below the eyes from the all the way down in duct tape. I think had that tape not been there, that piece of white plastic was so tight, you might have actually seen the outline of his features. That's how tight it was. So I thought that was interesting, and it becomes more interesting when we get a little further into some of the other testimony that came out. So one of the things that Detective Daniels, or Special Agent Daniels, noted was he showed pictures of the view from Chad Daybell's bedroom window, and it was, in fact, he could see both burial sites, which was really disturbing. And the kitchen window looked out over the area as well, and definitely had a very, very clear view of Tylee's burial spot. So then they went on to talk about the fire hose, or the fire ring. JJ's body was the first found, so they continued to excavate because they weren't sure at that point if they might find Tylee close by too. But they also had this other area that they wanted to look at around the fire pit, and in what was the family had called the pet cemetery. So when they went into that area, one of the first things they did was they had officers set up to set up a grid around the fire pit and to sift through the ashes of the fire pit and the grid area around the fire pit. When they did that, not only did they find bone shards and what appeared to be teeth, but they also found a silver necklace with a silver charm. There was also in the fire pit a very strong smell of accelerant of gasoline, which is interesting because, remember, they were excavating that site. The children were murdered in September, and they were excavating that site the following June because they had to wait until the winter snows were gone and the ground thawed. So it was interesting that there was enough accelerant there that it still smelled like gasoline when they started to dig through it. They started by hand, and then they brought in the backhoe, and then they discovered a bone. And so they went back to excavating with hand tools. This was in the area while they were sifting through the fire pit. They were also excavating an area, and it was interesting when they finally sort of explained how they pinpointed this area, because when the children went missing, before actually after the children's bodies were found, there was a news organization that posted on social media some satellite pictures that were taken around the time of the children's disappearances. And the FBI got those, or law enforcement got them. And they could see within, I want to say it was within hours of when they think Tylee's body was disposed, an area of soil that was disturbed. So that was really where the FBI was looking when they started looking for Tylee. And so they found bricks in the area, and then they found this like concrete had been sort of poured on top of the soil. They thought it was interesting that the person who had buried JJ had thought enough to sort of build a berm or a little mound over the top of the body, because as bodies decompose, the soil above them sinks. So putting up that slight berm would mean it would level out over time. So somebody thought about it. Maybe somebody who'd been a cemetery sexton before. The FBI's opinion was that the way that JJ was put in the ground was planful. That was something that they had said, there's a plan here, because he was tightly wrapped in duct tape in what they called a black tarp, something heavier than a black plastic bag. And then the planking and the rocks on top, they felt were designed to keep out scavengers. It was interesting that when they measured JJ's resting place, the lowest point was only 3 feet deep. So his grave was very shallow. And that, to me, sort of reinforced the idea that they did this in a hurry. They did Tylee in a hurry. They did because they were concerned somebody was going to catch them, or Tammy was going to come home, and so they were rushed at every turn. Rob Wood asked the agent about the difference between the way the bodies were disposed of, that there was this marked difference between JJ's body seemed to have been carefully placed. Tylee burned, dismembered, melted, huge contrast. They got into, John Thomas did some cross-examination. It mostly was sort of to poke holes in the officer's qualifications, which was impossible, and also, in their process. So the next person to come was Dr. Garth Warren. He's a forensic pathologist, and he was the medical examiner for the Ada County coroner. So after the bodies were recovered, they were stored for overnight at the morgue at the hospital in Rexburg. And the next day, Ray Hermosillo, Ron Ball, I think, could have been Stubbs. I'd have to go back and really look at my notes, but followed the coroner, Brenda Dye, in the coroner's van from Rexburg to Boise, to Ada County, where the autopsies took place. So JJ's autopsy said that the cause of death was asphyxia by a plastic bag over the head and duct tape over the mouth. He found bruises on JJ's upper arm. They were symmetrical, like somebody had grabbed him. And they also found scratches on JJ's cheek and neck, as if he had been trying to free himself of something over his mouth. So the medical examiner felt that JJ had died by suffocation. Let me see. They took samples of everything. He was still wearing his red pajamas and an overnight pull-up. This was the point that the court determined that they were going to limit the exhibition of all of the photos. So one of the things that the judge said, which is probably true, was he didn't want these photos flashed up on this big screen on the wall, because he felt like that was, having these images blown up was somewhat prejudicial. So, and he didn't want them displayed to the spectators. So at that point, they put all of the photos onto they showed them from a laptop. They were projected onto screens that were in front of the jury, and all of the screens that were in front of the lawyers were turned so that they couldn't be seen by the gallery. And then the feed was covered, the feed into the overflow room and the feed into Rexburg were covered. So for the autopsy photos, including the autopsy photos of Tylee, her remains were not shown. But certainly the descriptions were still more than enough to be troubling. My understanding, you all know, I'm in the overflow room. From folks that were in the viewing room, my understanding is that Lori turned her back to, and we saw this when the first pictures came up that we did see, the pictures of JJ's body being recovered out of the grave, and all of the pictures that were shown of the operation to recover their remains. And during that time, Rob Wood handed John Thomas a stack of photos and asked him to make sure and go through them to make sure he didn't have any objection to any of them. And while he was doing that, Lori turned her back to him and talked to Archibald. And then at the point where they were displayed, she put her head down and kind of did this. And then my understanding is that during the time that those images were being projected on screens, she also turned her back to the screen. So I did also JJ had bright red bruising under one of his fingernails, which was consistent with him trying to get something off of his head. Like he was scratching or struggling. There was a bruise on the lower leg and ankle, but it was a little bit difficult for the medical examiner to tell because remember, this was a body in decomposition. Okay, was decomposing. And but he did look at the bruises that were on JJ's arms, and it was evident that they were bruises that happened before death because they clearly there was hematoma. There was blood in the tissue where those bruises were. So he said that they, for Tylee, they couldn't use the usual process. The descriptions were hard, and I'm not going to go into them here. The descriptions are in the recordings, and they're difficult. They're hard to hear. So he did say that there was no evidence that she was alive when she was burned because there was not carbon monoxide in the tissues. He ruled her death a homicide with cause of death by unspecified means. That was because there was so little of her to analyze. John Thomas Cross, he went back over the doctor's education, sort of tried to poke some holes in his qualifications. The next person they called was Dr. Angie Christensen. She's a forensic anthropologist from the FBI at Quantico. And she did an examination of Tylee's skeletal remains. She is not, her team is not does not make positive identifications or determine causes of death. She received about 100 bones. She analyzed and took pictures and showed pictures. Her primary job was to analyze to see whether or not there was some sort of trauma to the bones. She identified what she called sharp trauma on several bones, the hip bones, the sacrum. Something sharp caused damage to those areas, something with a beveled edge like an axe. There was external force imposed on the bones, and the one thing that I thought that the defense did a good job of bringing out was there were pictures shown earlier when Detective Daniels, or Special Agent Daniels, was testifying about the evidence recovery team. He showed photographs of a lot of the evidence that they had collected, including a lot of tools out of Chad's shed. There were shovels and picks and cutting tools. And I thought the defense did a good job of pointing out that those tools were not sent to the FBI. So this expert, Dr. Christensen, couldn't compare the tools that they found in Chad's shed and determine whether any of them were responsible for any of those sharp trauma, those defects in the bones. She did say that the damage that she saw was not the typical damage that you see when a body is dismembered. Usually you see that damage at joint, where things are disjointed. But she also didn't have all the bones, so it was a little bit difficult for her to say one way or the other. They asked about tool marks, and she said, "I don't determine tool marks. I just find the defects." And lo and behold, the next person up was forensic examiner Douglas Halapaska, who is a tool mark expert, and was able to come in and talk about the fact that on several of the bones, the force from the impact actually started a fracture in the bone. He could not identify exactly what caused those injuries, and that was when John Thomas pointed out that they had failed to send the tools, so it was kind of impossible to do that. The next person was David Cincerbo, retired from the Idaho State Crime Lab. He was the forensic manager, and he took samples at the autopsy for both Tylee and JJ, and did the comparisons. He identified, compared with the DNA of parents, and determined that the sample he had came from the child of Dennis Todd Trahan, which would have been JJ's biological father, and the mother of Tylee Ryan, Lori Vallow. So they were all positively identified. The next person was Catherine Dace from the Idaho State Crime Lab, and she did DNA samples from the apartment, from apartment 175, and from the tools from Chad's. She also had DNA from the autopsy, so samples from all of the tape and the bags and what have you. She said that they swabbed apartment 175. There was swab on the knife was negative, but there was a weak positive from a swabbed wall in apartment 175. In the tools from Chad's shed, there were several presumptive spots of positive blood and flesh, and they tested positive for Tylee's DNA and blood. Which I think is helpful, because had they come back and said it's Chad's DNA, everybody would have said, well, of course it is. He lives there. He uses the tools. So the fact that it was Tylee's, and of course she doesn't live there, and the only way could be because those tools were used to spread her in the fire. I thought it was interesting that she said that in addition to the other profiles, she also tested samples from Melanie Gibb, Chad, and Richard Mao. So I thought those were kind of interesting, that they did sort of go a little far afield in looking to see whether or not there could have been other people whose DNA was there. So there were spots of blood on the handle that matched Tylee. She went through the duct tape. She tested the ends of the duct tape because she said often people tear it with their teeth and there can be saliva on the duct tape. So she tested for that. There were also hairs collected in the duct tape that wrapped the black bag. The hair collected was sent to a different lab. Now, what we don't know, and what is unlikely, is the test results from that DNA, because that was the information that was provided late and may not come in. The other problem is that the judge issued some limiting instructions, but they're all sealed. So we don't know for sure whether or not the judge said that data can't come in because of your because of the late production. She also tested the duct tape and the plastic tarp, the black plastic, for fingerprints, and found on the black plastic and the tape the right little finger of Alex Cox and the right palm of Alex Cox. So the next detective was the one who testified about the high-resolution satellite images. And then we got Samantha Gwillim, who is Tammy's sister. Tammy's sister testified about that she knew the location of what they called the pet cemetery, talked about how she loved animals, talked about how close they had been until they moved to Rexburg, talked about the fact that that they had all been close. They'd lived close by one another in Springville. She had seen Tammy every day when they lived in Springville, and that Chad had been close to her husband, and that they'd all had the families did a lot together. The kids did a lot together. She said she found out about Tammy's death from Chad when he called her, said Tammy had been sick. She got up and had a coughing fit. He woke up, that she rolled out of bed and was dead. Samantha said none of that made any sense to her because Tammy had just been there for a visit out of the blue in October. She didn't like to travel alone, so it was odd that she went alone. We know that that's because Chad told her that she needed to go. And then she was asked if Tammy ever said that she suspected that Chad was having an affair, and she said no, that Tammy had never mentioned anything to her, but that she'd seen a real change in the relationship. The first week in June of 2019, Chad and Tammy they went for a family gathering, family birthday party, and I think it may have been the same weekend that they were in. They were there for Heather Daybell had said that the Daybell family was having some kind of a gathering. But she said Chad and Tammy were very awkward, that they were distant. Chad wouldn't talk to Samantha's husband, which was odd because they'd all been close. And then in July, Tammy showed up at Samantha's front door and dropped off a birthday gift. Chad didn't come in. He waited in the car, and Tammy just sort of literally stood on the porch and talked to her for a few minutes and then left. So, and that was very strange. So she continued the next day. She said Chad was really distant. She said Tammy's funeral was very fast. Tammy and Chad's son, Mark, was on a mission in Africa and didn't have time to come home. She found out that Chad had remarried a month to the day after Tammy was buried. And she found out the wedding happened 2 weeks after Tammy died. He told her Lori's last name was Ryan. When she looked Lori up, she found out about her as Lori Vallow and about Charles's death. Chad had told her that they had bonded over the fact that they had both lost their spouses, that they had known one another for a while, and that Lori's husband had died of a heart attack. When she looked it up, she found out she looked at Charles's obituary and found a comment from Kay that said that they would be sure they were not to worry because they would be taking care of JJ. That was the first that she knew that there were any children involved, because Chad had told her that Lori didn't have any children. That they were. She had asked whether there were children, and Chad said no, they were going to be empty nesters. He didn't say where Lori's children were, just that they weren't there. The defense started their cross, and they brought up that that they had started the publishing company. They confirmed that Tammy didn't go to conferences, and they asked whether Chad had ever told her that what he wrote in his books was true. She said she didn't remember ever hearing that, and she didn't know whether Tammy believed what Chad wrote was true. But Tammy never told her that Chad had visions that Tammy was going to die. Chad never told her that. She said she suspected something was wrong with Tammy's death, and she felt that it was that her sister was telling her something had happened to her. She knew about the paintball incident. Her last visit with Tammy had been just before that, and they texted about the paintball incident. She never met Lori. Chad and Lori went to Knott's Berry Farm with all 5 of his adult children. Why Knott's Berry Farm? I don't know. And they also went to the beach. And then Archibald ends with, "I'm sorry for the loss of your sister," and sits down. It was pointed out, on redirect, that Chad had never supported the family without Tammy's help, and that he had told Samantha that Lori had lots of money. And asked her if all 5 of Chad's children were still alive, which I thought was interesting. Next was Deputy Coulter Cannon from Fremont County he's now a school resource officer, but he was called to the Daybell residence the night that she reported the paintball gun incident. He later went with the FBI to hunt for shell casings, and none were ever found. Then we got Helena Kaikamanu, who must be related to the Kaikamanu that we heard from earlier. He's a law enforcement officer from Rexburg. And she was a dispatcher. And so they played the 911 calls from the paintball gun incident. For those of you who don't know, they believe Alex Cox took a shot at Tammy and tried to kill her. Tammy thought someone was menacing her with a paintball gun. And so they played both of those calls. It was interesting because Tammy placed one of those 911 calls, and it was interesting to hear her voice. The next person was Christine Weiss, who was the dispatcher. So then we got Chad's 911 call the morning Tammy died. And they showed pictures of Tammy at the scene. One of the things they pointed out was that she had a red foamy sputum coming from her nose and running down and along the side of her cheek. There was a towel there that Chad had wiped it away at least once, and it was still coming out. And the other thing was that when they, well, I'll get to that. So the next person who was called was Cammie Wilborn. She's an EMT and also the assistant coroner. Now, the interesting thing about Idaho is Idaho has elected coroners. They are not medical examiners. Usually they're not medical people at all. In this case, the assistant coroner is an EMT. And I think Brenda Dye may be as well. She's the elected coroner. But the coroner is an elected position. They sign death certificates. It's more of an administrative job, but they do assign cause of death. So in a lot of jurisdictions, they have done away with elected coroners, and now what you have are medical examiners who are medical doctors. But in Idaho, you still have elected coroners. So Cammie Wilborn is the assistant coroner. She responded because Brenda Dye, the coroner, called her and said, "You're closer, you live closer. Can you get over there?" So she went right away. She thought Tammy had been dead for several hours. When she went over and touched the body, it was, as she said, the body was cold. Even the abdomen, which is usually the last area to cool, was cold. And rigor mortis had begun to set in. And there was a substantial lividity. Lividity is, it almost looks like bruising. It's once the heart stops pumping, all the blood in the body, gravity takes over and it sinks to the lowest part. So it was obvious that she'd been lying on the bed on her back for some period of time because lividity had already begun to develop. And so rigor mortis begins about 2 hours after death, completes, gets where the whole body is stiff in 6 to 8 hours. And then over time that goes away and the body relaxes again. And lividity sets in anywhere from 30 minutes to 4 hours. She testified that she usually expects it somewhere around 2 hours. So she sees the pink frothy foam. She's thinking congestive heart failure, no other signs. But it caused her enough concern that she looked at it up in her phone to see whether or not it could be caused by poisoning. Then when Brenda Dye arrived, Cammie Wilborn sort of deferred to her, and she took over talking to the family and asking questions. Chad told her that Tammy had low blood pressure and had been dizzy before, and that she preferred homeopathic remedies to medicine. Brenda Dye was, and when Cammie was asked about the conversation about the autopsy, she said that was between the family and Brenda Dye. So the next person to come was Brenda Dye, the coroner. Chad told her he'd been wiping the foam away from Tammy's mouth with a kitchen hand towel. Tammy, I mean, one of the things that was really a little heartbreaking for me was poor Tammy. She's lying on the bed. Her nightgown is kind of pulled up, and you can see her temple garments underneath and look like a pair of bike shorts. And to me, I just thought, this poor woman, I mean, the indignity that she had to suffer, both living and dead, was really awful. And it really touched my heart, that it seemed to me that she was the kind of person who wouldn't really have wanted people to see her in that condition. And certainly she seemed like a really modest person, and like someone that would not have really wanted people to see her that way. Brenda Dye estimated Tammy's time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. and said there was absolutely no way that that the body could have been in the condition it was in terms of the rigor and the lividity if she had just died, as Chad said, at somewhere around 5:30, and officials had shown up at 6. This was interesting. Then Brenda Dye talked about the fact that they asked her about her participation in taking Tylee and JJ's bodies to the coroner later. I thought this was very interesting. The next person they called was Mr. Cook. He's the Sugar City school IT guy. So Sugar City, if you leave Rexburg and you drive up the highway to St. Anthony, which is where Fremont County, the courthouse is, and for Fremont County, you pass through this little bitty bump in the road called Sugar City. And it's in between Rexburg and St. Anthony. And that was where the school was that Tammy taught at. So Mr. Cook comes and he says he's been through Tammy's emails. Now, there's always been a question about whether or not Tammy received an email from Charles Vallow. Well, that question was answered because he said he went through Tammy's email. There was an email from Charles that was read, moved into her deleted file, and she blocked his email. So that's interesting new information. And that was in June. So the trips that Samantha, her sister, talked about in June and July would have been after that. And there was trouble in their marriage, and they were awkward together, apparently because of that, because she did see Charles's email. The next person that they called was Kelsey Harris. She was a friend of Tammy's. She was, they worked together. Kelsey worked in the school kitchen where Tammy was the librarian. And Kelsey also taught a clog dancing class, and Tammy took her class. And she testified that Tammy participated and kept up. She was attending her classes just before her death. Nothing stood out or changed. And in fact, Kelsey had gone with Tammy to a high fitness class in late September of 2019. It was a high intensity class with a lot of ups and downs, and Tammy didn't seem to have any problems. The next person was Shannon Miller. She worked with Tammy at the Sugar City School District, and they took this high intensity fitness class with Tammy. She had been doing that class for a year and was attending very regularly. So where do we go from here? Because that was the last witness on Friday. Now, initially, the judge said, I'm going to put my laptop away so I'm not looking at it. Initially, the judge said that we were going to close out Friday early. And so we ended, actually, he had said we were going to end at 1:30 and decided we'd gotten through the mornings or the day's witnesses by 1 o'clock. The prosecution didn't want to call a new witness. And so the judge said, we're done. So we finished at 1 o'clock. Now, in my experience, usually that means we're going to finish, the prosecution's going to rest, we're going to end early, and then, especially if it's on a Friday, and then Monday morning, the defense is going to take over. So that's what I expected was going to happen. It did not happen. The piece we did not hear was Tammy's autopsy. Now, we did hear earlier, because we heard from the officer who was involved in getting the warrants and getting all of the legal documents and court orders necessary to exhume Tammy's body. We saw pictures of the exhumation. We saw pictures of how that was all done. But we have not heard from the medical examiner that did Tammy's autopsy. So I think that may be the last piece that we are trying to, that we're waiting for. So I don't know how close we are to the prosecution closing. I don't know how much more they could really offer. But I think that we're not going to see a tremendous amount of witnesses from the defense. I think we're going to see witnesses that will back up their claim of alibi. I think that's the witnesses we're going to see from the defense. Other than that, there's not a huge number of experts and witnesses that they can offer. But I think they are going to make the case that she was in Hawaii, she has an alibi. I think they're going to at least attempt to make that point. So I originally thought and predicted that we were going to see closing. We're going to see the prosecution rest on Friday, and we were going to see the defense take over on Monday, probably get closings on Tuesday or Wednesday. I still think we're going to get to closings this next week. I just do not see how much more of this case they could put on at this point. So I think we're going to get to the defense case early next week. I think we have maybe one or two more witnesses having to do with Tammy, including the medical examiner who did Tammy's autopsy, because we need to have Tammy's cause of death and cause and manner of death. And then I think we're going to see them rest, and we're going to see the defense. And I think this case goes to at least to closing arguments, if not to the jury, by Friday, which I really, really hope, because the following week I'm going to be gone because my daughter's wedding is the following weekend. So I have one of our great followers who is an experienced paralegal who worked for a death penalty attorney in Washington, is going to cover the trial for me. She lives here in Boise. She's been at the trial several times. And if, in fact, the trial goes beyond Monday the 8th, she's going to cover that week. But I really think we're going to get a wrap up next week. I still think that that's going to happen, even though we didn't get them resting on Friday. Now, I've talked myself blue in the face for almost an hour. I've given you an update. I know that you have a gazillion questions. First of all, I want to point out that there are almost 1,500 viewers in our chat tonight watching live, and I want to say thanks for that. That's the most we've ever had in our live chat, and we appreciate every one of you. I also want to say that we have added 2,000 subscribers in the last 2 weeks. We just hit 8,000, which is amazing. So thanks so much for doing that. Tell your friends, pass it on. This is interesting. And a lot of people have said, oh, no, this trial can't be over because we haven't heard from Melanice. That is Melanie Cope Boudreau Pulowski. She is Lori's niece. And we all started calling her Melanice to keep her separate from Melanie Gibb, who was one of Lori's good friends and was involved in her little coven of people casting out demons. I don't know that we need Melanice. First of all, I think if they were going to put her on, they would have put her on in back earlier when we had Melanie Gibb and Zulema on. That would have made more sense for her to be on there. I think that whatever she had to offer might be a little cumulative at this point. And I don't know what more she could add to the mix. We don't know whether she was offered a deal or not. I have suspected that she was, because she was charged with getting into Brandon Boudreau's bank accounts after they were divorced, and she was not supposed to. She was charged with ID theft and a couple of other things. 3 days later, those charges went away, which made me suspect that they had gotten something out of her. We don't know whether that's true or not. And we don't know whether what she knows is more applicable to the case in Arizona, because Melanice was very deeply involved with Lori in Arizona. And so I'm suspicious that we are not going to see Melanice in this case, and that she is going to be more instrumental in the Arizona charges for Charles Vallow. So I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. Gail Swift Fernandez. Have they really shown Lori caused all these killings? I sure hope so. I haven't heard Lori linked to the conspiracy. This is an excellent question, and it is a problem. I always describe a circumstantial case as a case that is like a chain, and you have to produce every link, and every link in the chain has to be linked up. And I think there are some holes in their chain. Now, I don't know whether or not they can synthesize all of this in closing arguments in a way that the jury's going to go, oh, yeah, So I think the clearest thing that has come out about the conspiracy is the telephone call the night that Tammy was shot at. So Zulema testified that when the night on October 9th, when Tammy was shot at and thought it was a paintball gun, they're pretty sure it was Alex. And the thing that is interesting is Lori was in Arizona, and it was like they were always trying to give Lori an alibi. She was always gone when these things were happening. So she was in Arizona. She was in Arizona with her little coven, with Zulema and Melanie and Melanie Gibb, and they were all there, and they were doing a casting to cast the evil spirit out of Tammy Daybell. And she got on the phone. Of course, somebody takes a couple of shots at Tammy. They miss, and the guy runs away. And down in Arizona, Lori's on the phone, and Zulema overhears this phone call. She's calling Chad, because she always had to call Chad to find out whether or not their castings, whether or not they'd worked. So she calls Chad and said, did it work? And he tells her, we don't hear his side of the conversation, of course. Zulema only hears Lori's, but Lori becomes furious. She becomes what Zulema says is very, very scary mad. And she's saying things like he's stupid and what a moron, and she's stomping around furious. And she says on the phone, he is such an idiot. He cannot do anything right. Well, we have lots of connections that indicate that it was Alex Cox that was shooting at Tammy, and that Lori knew it and was complaining because he'd screwed up and had not killed Tammy. So that one is a really big, like, flashing light sort of connection with the conspiracy. Now, I don't know how you extrapolate that into the rest of the conspiracies, and that's going to be a little interesting. But I think they have conspiracy to commit murder for Tammy locked down. I think that one is pretty clear. The other connective tissue is a little bit less convincing. We do have a lot of cell phone data, and the cell phone data shows that there were lots of telephone calls and text messages going back and forth between Chad and Lori and Alex and Lori and Chad and Alex. And, there were texts and phone calls shooting back and forth between the three of them all during that time that the bodies were being disposed of. So we know that. Whether or not the prosecution is going to be able to connect those up is a little bit less certain, because we don't have a smoking gun in that one. We don't have a text message. We don't have a witnessed call or any of those other things. So it is a little less clear. And I think that's concerning. But I think that I hope that the prosecution is going to be able to synthesize all that information into a form that's going to make sense to the jury, and they're going to be able to connect up those. Yeah, she may have been in Hawaii, but you can be anywhere at any time and participate in a conspiracy. And remember, the conspiracy has to be that you agree to commit the crime, and that one of the members of the conspiracy takes a step in that direction. So I think they're going to get there, but I don't think the connection is as clear when it comes to Lori and the kids. So that's an excellent question. And that is because you guys have been watching for a year and have been, it's like you're all 1Ls now. You've been going to law school. So we get great questions that are great legal questions. Question: some people don't think that the state has met the burden of first-degree murder for Lori, according to Idaho law. State says she didn't have to do the act. What do you think? So under the aid and abet theory, I think they do get there. They do get to first-degree murder under that aid and abet theory. Is it the best connection? Again, the conspiracy and the aid and abet are harder to pinpoint. I mean, I think it makes some sense that they weren't the brightest bulbs, but they still were smart enough not to be sending text messages back and forth that clearly outlined what they were doing. So I think that's typical that you would have to connect those circumstantial, the fact that they were all communicating as Alex and potentially Chad were burying bodies in the backyard. That's a different. I mean, I think that is circumstantial evidence that they all knew what was going on, but is it beyond a reasonable doubt? That's the other question. So, good question. Need a little more rosé. You guys are going to give me a workout tonight. Hi, Rowan. Question: how can they legally charge Chad and Lori with Tammy's murder when the official death certificate hasn't been changed from natural to homicide? They can do it because the medical examiner has said her death was a homicide. When they asked the medical examiner about it, the medical examiner said when she talked to Vital Statistics, they said they would not change the cause of death until after the trial. I don't know why they decided that, but to be honest, the determination on a death certificate is purely an administrative function. And so, and death certificates do get changed when additional information comes in. So I think what they would say is we haven't changed it yet, but it will be changed. And in the meantime, we have a medical examiner who says, without a doubt, her cause of death was a homicide. So, but that's a good question. And, I think it's important to remember that investigations can change people's evaluations about those sorts of things, as they have in this case. And, I'm not sure that it is as important what the legal death certificate says as it is to see what the medical examiner says. Oh, hi, Denicia. Well, let's talk about what an Alford plea is, because this is a really good question. An Alford plea, the Alford case is what established this. And this is a long-standing case out of the federal Supreme Court. And what happened was Mr. Alford said, he had been accused of murder, and the prosecution had sought the death penalty, just like this case. And he said, they've made me a deal. They've offered me a plea, and they've said they'll take the death penalty off the table if I'll plead. But I really didn't murder this person. And so I want to take advantage of the deal, but I don't want to admit that I'm guilty. So he initially was convicted, and they then, the Supreme Court then reversed his conviction and said no, that he could plead guilty by way of Alford, is what it's called now. And what that means is, what he's saying is, I don't want to plead guilty because I'm not guilty. However, I believe the state has sufficient evidence to prove me guilty, and I want to take advantage of the deal. So that is what would have to happen in order for Chad to take an Alford plea. He would have to say, I'm not guilty, but I want to take advantage of the deal they're going to offer me and take the death penalty off the table. And so I'm going to plead guilty by way of Alford. An Alford plea is still a guilty plea. So you still have to make an admission of guilt. I don't know what the prosecution will do in this case. So what I've said is, the prosecution doesn't want to try this case again. It has been 5 blisteringly busy and demanding weeks for them. It's been expensive. It's been demanding. And if they had the choice, I don't think I don't think they'd want to do it again. So I think they're going to be willing, and 2 things are happening. One, Chad and his attorney are seeing all the way that the prosecution's case is coming together, and the prosecution doesn't want to try the case again. So I think what's happening is, I think what is likely to happen is that Chad's going to take a plea. And it may be an Alford plea. I don't know. That would depend on whether the prosecution would allow him to do that or not. I think everybody wants both of them to sit down and say, okay, here's the truth about everything that happened. I don't know that we're ever going to get there. I don't know that they're ever going to get to the point of saying, yes, I'm guilty, and here's how it went down. Maybe after all the court is done, we might see that. I don't know yet. But I do know that I think there's about a 50-50 chance that Chad will take a deal. I think that there would be some real questions about equal protection and due process if Chad is convicted of the death penalty after they've taken it off the table for Lori. So I think there are some real questions ahead about how that all comes together, whether or not Chad is going to take a deal. If so, what is that going to look like? And whether or not he would be able to take an Alford plea. Alfred pleas they're fairly common in criminal law. Definitely more common in high high consequence cases. So, serious felony cases. Kathleen, from your time in the courtroom, what's your perception of the jury's view of Lori? So what's interesting is the way they have the court organized. And if you get my newsletter, I drew a little diagram so everybody could see where everybody is. But essentially, when you walk in the courtroom, the jury is along one wall, and there are windows along the other wall, and the judge's bench is directly in front. So what they've done is they have turned Lori, the defense table, this way so that the jury has a direct, straight-on view. They're looking eye to eye with Lori. And I think that was an interesting choice. I think it's helpful with the cameras and the live feed. I think it was helpful for that reason, but it was an interesting choice. And I will say there was one particular juror, male juror, probably mid-30s, maybe a little older. And he was sort of closest to where my end of the jury box when I was sitting in the gallery. And you could tell by the look, he's the kind of guy who doesn't ever cloud his emotions. And you could really tell. He was mad. He was shooting daggers at her. The jury was very shocked when the information about Charles Vallow's death came out. You could you could have knocked their eyes off with a stick. They were all like, so I think they have, I have seen them look really disgusted with her, and seen them, wipe tears during the time that hard pictures were shown. So I can't say at this point what I think the jury's going to do, but I think they have been very, very attentive. And I certainly think that there have been times that they have shown emotion and had shown a response to Lori, and they're not impressed. Summer's call was a huge revelation, and it seems like a bombshell. It seems that some of the things in that call do connect to Lori. What are your thoughts on the phone call? Well, I have to agree. That her saying some of the things she said sort of bordered on, for one thing, Summer says, you were dancing on the beach while your children were in the ground in Chad's backyard. And she says, it was months later, and I was just trying to get on with my life. That in itself was very clear that she knew the children were dead. So that was one of those, I think that from there, that was one of those things you could draw on and say, okay, she knew the children were dead. And it had been months, 6 weeks, but who's counting? So I do think, and I also think just her demeanor on the phone. I can't talk about it. You know me. I think one of the most telling things on the phone call with Colby was one of the first things that's said. He says something about maybe because you murdered my siblings, and she says, I didn't. And there's a big emphasis on the word I didn't. And I'm sorry you feel that way. And so, there are definitely some tells in those calls, regardless of how careful she's being. I think there are some tells in the call between her and Chad the morning the kids' bodies are found. The first thing she says is, are they seizing things again? She just almost asks him outright, did they find them? And then at the sort of last minute, she sort of couches it. And are they seizing things again? So, I mean, I think there are some real, she telegraphs in several phone calls. And I do think that there are some things, and it's going to be important for the prosecution to synthesize all those things and to point those instances out to the jury. Because the jury has gotten a huge amount of information and they're going to have to sift through all that. But the prosecution being able to sort of connect up the dots is going to help them get beyond that reasonable doubt. So, good questions. Question: will Maricopa County bother spending the funds to try Lori if she gets life without parole in Idaho? Yeah, I think probably they will. For a couple of reasons. One, because I think that Kay and Larry will insist. I think that Kay will feel that Charles Vallow deserves justice just as much as JJ and Tylee and Tammy do. So I think Kay will adamantly demand that that Lori be held responsible for Charles's murder. And the way it works, there were some questions, so I'll just grab those. If Lori's convicted and gets life without parole, she will then go to Arizona and she will answer those charges. She will get credit for the time that she's served in Arizona against her Idaho sentence. So if it were a determinate sentence, she would get credit for that. If it's life without parole, then credit's not really going to matter. And then what would happen is she would either plead or go to trial there. Whatever her sentence is there would be served after her sentence in Idaho. Now, the reason that's good is it's sort of like belt and suspenders, because if she's got an Arizona sentence hanging over her head, no matter what happens in Idaho, if her case gets overturned, any of those things happen, she bounces to Arizona and she will not be released. No matter what were to happen here in Idaho, she would go on to serve a sentence in Arizona. So I think the prosecutors are probably going to encourage everyone to go forward with those charges. Mom on the case. Question: would the state benefit from bringing the best evidence out sooner rather than later? What strategies do you see the prosecution using, and is it effective in this case, in your opinion? So this is a really complex case. It has a complex timeline because it happened over an extended period of time. It's complex because it's complex in terms of jurisdiction. There's several different places these people are. There's a lot of people involved. So it has a lot of moving parts. I think they did a pretty good job of putting it on relatively chronologically. But the other thing that you always want to do when you're putting on a case is you want to think of it that you're telling a story. And so you want to make sure that that your story has some emotional peaks in it as well, because that keeps the attention of the jury. So, for example, doing some dry scientific information and then bringing in Zulema, and then doing a little bit more of the dry scientific stuff and then bringing in Summer, those were all sort of calculated to remind the jury of why they're there, that there are these people whose lives were cut short by these people. It's not just cell phone coordinates, because people can get so deep in the weeds on all that scientific stuff that it can be one of those, why are we here again? So I think the prosecution did a pretty good job of keeping the information flowing and still keeping the emotional pace of the trial at a good place, so that the jury never loses sight of the fact that these are people, that we're not just talking about cell phone coordinates or scientific DNA reports um, or laser measurements of holes in the ground. We're talking about living, breathing people. And I think they did a pretty good job of keeping that emotional pace as well. I think that for the jury to really start to understand why, I think probably some of the cell data was some of their best evidence. But for the jury to understand why that was good evidence and why it was important, they had to know the story first. They had to know that Lori had two children and Chad and Lori got together and Chad and Lori thought they were gods. And I mean, they had to know some of that backstory before that really dry sort of scientific stuff started to make sense. They had to have those sort of knowledge hooks to hang stuff on. So it's always a fine dance of do you bring out your best evidence? Do you bring out your bombshells? In this case, I just don't see that we who've been following the case for a long time didn't see anything new. So in that regard, I'm not sure they were bombshells. But I think the jury saw them as bombshells. And I think some of the bombshells were Charles Vallow's death. They also snuck in that Joseph Ryan's dead. They didn't get deeply into it, but they did sort of sneak in that extra information that Joe Ryan's dead too. So I think I think they did a pretty good job of keeping the pace going and of putting the evidence out in a way that was understandable and absorbable by the jury because there's so darn much of it. So that's a good question. That gets into legal strategy. I mean, it really gets beyond how you put the case together and gets into the sort of strategic planning that goes into how you put the case together. Can Lori be tried in Arizona while waiting for appeal? Yes, she can. And it's likely that will happen. Appeals take forever. And so in the case of a death penalty appeal, they kind of move to the front of the line. But since this isn't a death penalty appeal, I think you can anticipate it's going to take 2 or 3 years for that appeal to wind its way through. I mean, it takes a year before the court even finally gets all the briefs. So it would easily be 2 or 3 years that she could be on appeal. And if that's the case, there's no reason why she couldn't go to Arizona and answer those charges there. So good questions. LV, like John Thomas watching Law and Order, when characters plead guilty, they had to allocute to the crime. Does that ever happen in real life? It depends upon the state. So there's a couple of things that can happen. Usually what happens is that the prosecutor will give a factual basis for the case. So the judge will say, will ask the defendant, how do you plead? And then the prosecutor will say the legal basis for the plea is, and will recite the facts of the case. So that often happens. There are also states courts that require the person to say what they did. And there are judges sometimes that will say, you need to tell me in your own words what you did before I will accept your guilty plea. It doesn't always happen. So I can't say at this point whether if she were taking a guilty plea in Arizona, if she would have to make that allocution, or whether if Chad is required to do that in Idaho. It often depends on the judge and the jurisdiction. So, but the prosecutor will give what they would call the factual basis for the case. You guys are giving me a workout tonight. Kelly J. Why did the prosecution take so long? And that's why they took the death off the table. Did they mess up? Oh, so yes, they absolutely did mess up. So the prosecution has had 3 years to get their act together and to prepare this case. Now, the lab did discover a hair that they were concerned had not been previously located, and they wanted to have that tested. So that was late discovery. Okay, late discovered information. But there were 300 hours of jail calls that the defense had asked for, and that the prosecution had said, yeah, we'll get them to you, and never did. And that was back in June of last year, they asked for those. So there were some real deficits on the part of the prosecution, and here's the problem. They're very small offices. Fremont County, I think, has 2 prosecuting lawyers and maybe 1 legal assistant. Madison County, I think, has 3 or 4 lawyers. I mean, they're tiny. So there's no way to handle these. They were talking about terabytes of data, right? I mean, just the cell data alone probably filled a whole banker's box. So what they should have done, now this is the part that kind of bugs me. By the time they started this trial, according to Nate Eaton and his research at East Idaho News, they had already spent $3.6 million investigating and preparing for this trial. There is no excuse for the fact that they did not hire an individual whose job was to manage that discovery. In every big case, you hire a discovery clerk, and that person's job is to keep track of every bit of that data and to know where it went, who got it, when they got it, and to have a complete record of when it was sent to the prosecution or it went sent to the defense, who signed for it. I mean, that's that person's job, and they do nothing but manage all of that discovery. And they did not do that. With all that money to spend, they didn't do it. And as a result, they stumbled across a bunch of information that should have been provided to the defense months before, didn't get provided. And that was a huge mistake on their part. Now, the judge gave them a break on a few of them and said, okay, well, I'm going to, so you got it in just before the discovery deadline. One of them was late, but only a few hours. I'll give you those. But the stuff that was turned over that was blatantly after the discovery deadline, the judge said, I'm not going to let it in, and I'm taking the death penalty off the table as a punishment for you not making sure that your discovery was in order. So yeah, the prosecution did screw up. And why it took them so long is because they're spread really thin. My never humble opinion is that they should have turned this over to the state AG, the state attorney general's office, and left it there. But when Lindsay Blake was elected, she promptly went and took Tammy Daybell's case back. And I don't know why. I suppose that this is the kind of case that can make a career. But it's also, if we know anything, also the kind of case that can destroy a career. Just ask the lawyers in the Jodi Arias case. So, because they all got disbarred. So, I mean, I think they made some tremendous mistakes, and I think it was unfortunate that they didn't do a better job on the administrative end of it. So that's why death got taken off the table for Lori, and why I think it's going to get taken off for Chad as well. I hope you all are enjoying an adult beverage. Hi, Tracy Dale. What about Melanie P? You don't think she'll testify, or Ian? I don't think they need her. I think her testimony is probably cumulative, and I think it makes more sense. I think she's more helpful in the Arizona case because she was close to Lori. She knew Charles. She knew, she had way more understanding of what was going on. And I think if they were going to call her, they would have called her during the time that they called Zulema and Melanie Gibb. So it may be that they thought her testimony was kind of cumulative, that they could get what they needed out of the other two. And so and she may not be a great witness. I don't know. I mean, everything we've seen in her interviews is she's not necessarily a great witness. So, I mean, I don't know. They could surprise me, and she could be next on the witness list. That's the other thing. The witness lists are sealed, so we have no idea who's on them. There's lots of speculation and whispers and all those things, but to be honest, we don't know right now. So, I mean, that's just my best guess reading the tea leaves, but I could be wrong. Y'all could be right. What was your take of Thomas asking to reference his knowledge in movies and what he'd seen on TV? Do you view that as a failed cross question? Absolutely, it was a failed cross question. So the jury is looking for lawyers to be experts, to have more education and to be more informed than they are, even if that means just asking the right questions of the jury. So him saying, well, that's what I see in the movies, was absurd. And it was a big misstep on his part. Yeah. I mean, we ask jurors to set aside what they have seen on CSI. We certainly are not going to expect that our lawyers are going to get their legal education from Law and Order. Venus Gal. Is it typical for witness lists to be sealed? No, it's not. It's yet again more of the things that this judge has decided it is necessary to seal. Now, it's understandable if you have a lengthy witness list that has a lot of lay witnesses, so people who are non-law enforcement, that you will want to protect their addresses. One of the reasons why you exchange witness lists between the prosecution and the defense is the prosecution says, here's all my witnesses. And then the defense has the opportunity to find out whether or not they have any impeachables, whether or not these people have criminal histories, whether they have other things, crimes of dishonesty, things that would indicate that they could not be honest witnesses. So one of the things that happens in a witness list is you list all your witnesses, their home addresses, and their birth dates so that the other side can run criminal background checks on them. So those are the things that you would expect would be redacted because you don't want to give people's home addresses and their birth dates out. That's just personal information that shouldn't be shared. So those are usually redacted, but you certainly would get a list that would be public that would list all of the people on their witness list. Now, just because they're on the witness list doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be called. Think back to Murdoch, there were 200 plus people on the witness list and they only called about a fraction of those. So, you can't always rely on the fact that a witness list it's not carved in stone. And people who are on the list may never show up on the stand, but it's not typical for them to be sealed. But then it's not typical for a lot of things in this case that have been sealed to be sealed. So. Is there a reason why the state doesn't directly ask witnesses like Mel Gibb or Zulema, do you know who killed the children and or Tammy? I'm certain that law enforcement have asked them that question. I don't know that it gets them anywhere. I mean, what would it get them if they asked Melanie Gibb on the stand, do you know who killed the children? And she says, no, but I know it wasn't Lori. Then, how does that help? I'm not sure it helps either way. I'm certain the law enforcement asked them, and certainly if anyone knew who had killed the children, that would have been asked, and they would have been witnesses who said, Lori told me she killed her kids. So I think it's kind of a pointless question, because if law enforcement had an answer that was relevant to the case, we would know it. Otherwise, it's kind of a throwaway question. Flashback. Does Lori's defense team get paid the same rate as if they were billing in a private party? Absolutely not. Death penalty attorneys are paid more than public defenders in other cases, but it is nowhere near what they would charge per hour if they were billing a private party. They're substantially reduced rates. I think I heard, and I don't quote me, but I think I heard that Idaho public defenders make $100 to $125 an hour, which is about half of what they would make in the private sector if they were representing somebody privately. So, yeah. There is a public defense crisis throughout the country, and that is because many states, my home state of Oregon included, have not, their rate of pay for public defenders has not kept up. So lawyers are going other places, and it is very, very difficult to get new lawyers into public defense work because they're simply not paid anywhere near commensurate wages. I guarantee you that the prosecution and the defense are not getting paid equally. The prosecution gets paid much more because they're state employees, and they get state retirement, and they get a whole lot of other things that the public defenders don't get. So it's a very unfair system, and the states have been doing it on the cheap for a long time, and it's coming back to bite them because they can't get people. In Oregon right now, they're talking about insisting that civil attorneys take so many public defense cases because they can't get public defenders. And that's not constitutional either. So it's really has reached crisis levels. In Oregon, we had the Sixth Amendment Center, which is an organization that looks at public defense, did a study in Oregon 5 or 6 years ago and found that we were headed in the direction we are now. Right now in Oregon, there are not enough public defenders, and they're getting to the point where prosecutors are having to dismiss cases because they can't get public defenders. And they're having to release people from jail because they can't get public defenders. So, yeah, it's rough, and the funding is not great. Would Ian's testimony be more damning since he acted on behalf of the FBI, and how afraid he was for his own kids because of the stuff Mel P told him and talk of kids going dark, etc.? Maybe, but remember that that's a lot of hearsay. I mean, it's what Melanie Pawlowski, his wife, told him. It's not what Lori told him. Remember that by the time Ian Pawlowski got involved and married Melanie, who he'd known for 2 weeks, this train had already left the station. They were already all living in Rexburg, and all of this was already in motion. So I don't know that it would be that easy to get it in, because what Melanie Pawlowski told her husband is hearsay. And she's not going to be able to say much about what Lori said. So we don't know what their statements are. We know what they said on TV. We know a few things that were in some of the Arizona documents, but we don't really know for certain what they could actually concretely tell anybody. So, I mean, it's juicy, but I don't know that it's something that would come in at trial. So, but that's a good question. I mean, Do I think that Melanie Pulowski and Ian Pulowski are idiots and that they were probably more involved, at least Melanie's probably more involved than anybody knows? Probably. But the question is, can you get it in court? And I think the answer on that one's probably not. So, good questions. Gritty Grat. Since there's been evidence presented that Lori and Chad gave Alex the job of hitman, isn't that evidence of a conspiracy? Well, I'm not certain that there's proof that they made him a hitman. There's evidence that they said he was her protector and he was her warrior, and that he had been her protector in past lives. But what does that mean? Does that mean that he was to protect her when her kids turned dark? Or does that mean that he was her spiritual warrior? I mean, that's a little bit of a gray area. So I don't think that you get to the level of proving a conspiracy because Chad gave him a patriarchal blessing and said, you are Lori's protector and her angel, her spiritual, her like her spiritual twin, that you've been with her through all these lives and your job has always been to protect her. I don't know whether you get to conspiracy from that. It's a good question. I think part of that is going to be how the prosecution synthesizes that information. So we're almost at the 2-hour mark. So I hope that we're kind of running out of questions, although you never seem to run out of questions. And so I'm thinking that we'll take 2 or 3 more and then we'll wrap it up. Please, if we did not get to your questions, put them in the comments and I will get to them. I promise. It might not be next week, but I promise I will get back to you. And if you're feeling a little nervous about posting your questions publicly, email me directly and I'm happy to answer the questions. And I appreciate that you're all a little patient with me right now while I'm attending the trial. Another question, do you think Pryor will or should encourage Chad to plead? I don't know that we ever encourage, but I think that we sit down with our client and we have a really frank discussion. We say, I always said, I feel like it's laying out the buffet and saying you get to pick what dishes you choose. So for me, I would always say to my clients, here are all your options. Here's option A, and here's what would happen if you choose that. Here's option B, and what will happen if you choose that one. Here's option C, and what will happen if you choose C. So, and I think that's the lawyer's job, is to lay it all out for your client and say, here are the options. I mean, I've had people say, what would you do? And I've said, I'm not you. If you were my mom or you were my sister, I think I would tell you X. But remember, I'm not the only voice you should be listening to. First of all, you need to listen to the voice inside you, but you also need to have conversations with people who know you and love you about what the choices are. So, I mean, I would think Pryor would do the same thing. He would say, look, here, Chad, these are all the choices, and here's what the consequence of that choice would be. So if you choose this is the outcome. And I really think you ought to mull it over. You ought to pray if you're still doing that. You ought to talk it over with your family, your kids, and then you ought to reach a decision and let me know. I think that's always the best way to approach it, to remember that your client is the person who is going to reap the consequence of the decision. And it shouldn't be your decision. It should be your role to advise them, but it shouldn't be your decision. So I don't think that Pryor will say, Chad, look, you got to take this deal. I mean, I think he'll go to him and say, man, I'm bringing you a good deal. Let's think this through together, and then you decide. It's kind of a fine line, I guess. Hazelnut. Is it usual for all of law enforcement to be kept under subpoena after they've testified a time or two? It seems Rob Wood has had a hard time to let law enforcement go. And thank you for your hard work. Well, thanks for tuning in and being interested in the case and sticking with us. And you're absolutely welcome for the hard work, because it's been an honor getting to know everybody, and I love doing it. It is a little unusual, but when you subpoena a law enforcement agent, there's a couple of things. First of all, you have to give them, depends on the state, but you have to give them additional lead time. So if you're going to subpoena an officer, you have to do it like 10 days ahead of their appearance. And there are more hoops to jump through when you are subpoenaing a law enforcement agent. So it makes sense, rather than have to redo that if you have to recall them, to keep them under subpoena until the trial is done. Because it's possible, and it's more likely, that you're going to recall a law enforcement agent, a law enforcement officer, to talk about some specific piece of evidence or something that got overlooked. So I don't know, it's all that unusual. Usually you would keep at least your lead officer under subpoena, just because you don't want to get to the last day you're going to rest and you realize, ooh, I need officer to come back in and cover this piece that's missing. And you look and, oh, by the way, I got to give him 10 days notice before I can resubpoena him. So I think that's the reason why it's more of an administrative thing. And it just keeps the agency, the law enforcement agency, on notice that they may have to find a replacement for that officer, because those officers are all still on duty. They're all out doing their jobs. So if they have to appear in court, then that puts their employer, the agency, on notice that they've got to find a replacement for that officer while he's cooling his jets in the hall of the courthouse. So for that, I think that's the reason why they haven't released the law enforcement people that are under subpoena. And it makes sense. It's efficient. So absolutely. Thank you so much. We're at the 2-hour mark, and I just want to say thanks again. My mind is blown by 8,000 subscribers. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for following me when I appear on other people's shows. I've been honored recently to appear with Elizabeth Vargas and with Gigi on News Nation. I have appeared on the Cuomo Show. I've appeared on Surviving the Survivor with Jill Waldman, and also on Harvard lawyer Lee on her show. I was on with her on yesterday just. And so it's been really exciting getting to know lots of people in the true crime community. It's been a great opportunity for me. And I thank you so much for following me, for joining me, and for all that you are doing in the true crime community. I want to also say thank you for all of your Super Chat and PayPal donations. All goes directly to my moderators. And I love being able to pass that on to them and be a little bit of a blessing in their life. So I'm going to say good night. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will see you. Look for the possibility of some surprise lives next week if things go along the line that I think they will. And so if you have not, hit the subscribe and the notification bell, please do that, because then you'll get notified if we're going to have some surprise lives. And if not, I'll see you on Saturday, same time, next Saturday, for the next 2-hour wrap up. Good night, y'all.